Hello everyone, this is Waleed, and we are here with our Flutter Quiz League Day 2. And today we have Sakina with us. Sakina, hello, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Alid?
I'm good too, Alhamdulillah. So today we have Sakina. Sakina has joined us in Flutter Pakistan recently, and she has been given a few couple of talks before as well. So before I formally introduce Sakina to you guys, तो उससे पहले मैं हम लोग जो है वो as usual एक intro की तरफ चलते हैं. So for those uh, who are new right now, जिन्होंने जो ये पहला सेशन अटेंड कर रहे हैं, इससे पहले अटेंड नहीं कर सके थे, तो उनके लिए आई जस्ट आई गो थ्रू फ्लटर वंस अगेन. फ्लटर इज लिटरल यूआई क्रॉस प्लेटफॉर्म टूल किट. तो इसमें ये होता है कि यू कैन डेवलप एप्स फॉर मोबाइल, फॉर डेस्कटॉप, फॉर वेब, फॉर एम्बेडेड, ऑल इन अ सिंगल कोड बेस. सो इसके पीछे फ्लटर की अपनी डार्ट लैंग्वेजेस होती है, and you can compile all those things natively to every each and every platform. So ये small talk में जो है Flutter is literal cross platform UI toolkit. So what is Flutter Quiz League? Okay, so this was as usual we announced a couple of times कि ये 5 amazing online talks की एक series हमने शुरू की थी, जिसका सेकंड पार्ट आज है. सो टुडे इज़ द सेकंड टॉक, डे 2. और हम इस तरह 5 टॉक्स करेंगे. हर टॉक के बाद एक क्विज होगा, दैट वुड बी ऑनलाइन क्विज, और दैट वुड बी टोटली बेस्ड अपॉन द फास्टेस्ट फिंगर्स फर्स्ट. क्या आप लोग जितनी जल्दी जितने सही आंसर्स देंगे दैट विल बी क्लोज टू विनिंग. और वी आर गिविंग अवे फ्लटर बॉक्सेस फॉर द विनर्स. एंड इसके लिए आपके पास 15 मिनट्स होंगे, और मोस्ट प्रोबेबली सिर्फ 10 क्वेश्चन होते हैं, तो वो शुरू के 2-3 मिनट में यू कैन ईजिली सॉल्व इट. तो द फास्टेस्ट फिंगर्स फर्स्ट विल बी एलिजिबल फॉर फ्लटर बॉक्स. अच्छा, सो दिस वाज आवर स्केड्यूल इनिशियली. तो आज जो है वो सकीना की टॉक है, एंड देन each alternate day we have a talk at 8:30 p.m. So on August 10th we have a talk, on 12th we have a talk, and on 14th we have a talk. So today we have Sakina with us. So let's just for the sake of quiz, I need to tell you the rules. तो जो लोग नए हैं, जिन लोगों ने पिछला अटेंड नहीं किया था, उन लोगों के लिए बता दूं मैं कि आप लोगों को कंप्लीट टॉक देखना ज़रूरी है. You will have to watch the complete talk till the end in order to be able to attend the quiz, because quiz के questions ज़्यादातर जो हैं वो आपके टॉक से होंगे. तो इसमें एक इम्पॉर्टेंट बात यह है कि you do not need necessarily to answer all the 10 questions correct. ठीक है, तो ये मत समझिएगा कि आप ज़्यादा टाइम लगा के 10 क्वेश्चंस के आंसर्स कर रहे हैं तो यू विल विन अ फ्लटर बॉक्स. दिस इज नॉट ओनली अबाउट आंसरिंग 10 करेक्ट क्वेश्चंस. दिस इज अबाउट आंसरिंग मैक्सिमम करेक्ट क्वेश्चंस इन द मिनिमम पॉसिबल टाइम. तो अगर आपने 15 मिनट लेके 10 क्वेश्चन सॉल्व किए हैं और 10 के 10 सही दे दिए हैं, तो इट्स वेरी मच पॉसिबल कि आप विन नहीं करेंगे. बिकॉज अगर किसी ने 7 क्वेश्चन या 8 क्वेश्चन सही आंसर किए हैं, शुरू के 2 मिनट में कर दिए हैं, तो वो रेशियो जो है दैट इज अ कॉम्बिनेशन. द एल्गोरिथम ऑफ विनिंग इज स्कोर जो निकलता है, स्कोर इज अ कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ करेक्ट आंसर्स टू द मिनिमम पॉसिबल टाइम टेकन. तो कोशिश करें कि जल्द से जल्द ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा सही जवाब दें. दैट इज़ द होल आइडिया. ये सारी गेम ही टाइम की है. सो इसमें एक और चीज़ ये है कि गूगल साइन इन आप पहले से रखिएगा अपने ब्राउजर्स में. सो वी डू नॉट रिकमेंड कि आप इनकॉग्निटो में हो, सो दैट यू विल वेस्ट टाइम इन साइनिंग इन टू द गूगल, और फिर वो आपका टाइम वेस्ट होगा, तो अदर्स विल गेट अप. तो विनर्स जो हैं वो अगले दिन अनाउंस हो जाएंगे, एंड मोस्ट प्रोबेबली वी आर ट्राइंग के हम फ्लटर बॉक्स से साथ साथ शिप करें, बट आइडियली जब लीग एंड हो जाएगी देन विल शिप द फ्लटर बॉक्सेस टू द विनर्स. सो लेट्स जस्ट introduce our speaker, our worthy speaker. She is running a software house. तो सकीना की मुझे सबसे ज़्यादा इंटरेस्टिंग जो मुझे बात है सकीना के बारे में वो यही है कि शी इज़ रनिंग अ सॉफ्टवेयर हाउस. So she is a CEO and she's a co-founder of Reactory software development house. तो इनका जो पर्सपेक्टिव है ना, from the CEO perspective, from the business perspective, वो बड़ा important है. So a person who is who is into business side and who is coding as well, तो उसका जो insights हैं, उसकी जो उसके जो क्या 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 कहना चाहिए कि उसकी जो वैल्यूएबल एक्सपर्टीज है और वैल्यूएबल उसका एक्सपीरियंस जो है वो बहुत मैटर करता है. सो आई वांट यू गाइस टू लिसन टू हर carefully, and so that you can learn from her as well, and then you can attempt the quiz as well. So she has been developing a lot of different solutions using technology, और recently अभी Flutter Pakistan उन्होंने join किया, and we are proud to have her. Sakina, over to you. Are you ready for your presentation? Should I share your screen?
Yep, I'm absolutely ready.
Okay, so I am out and you are on board. Thank you.
Okay, hello and assalamu alaikum, everyone. How are you guys doing? I hope you're having a wonderful weekend and definitely enjoying this rainy weather. So, thank you, Walid, for this wonderful introduction. I don't think after all of those praiseworthy words, I don't have to say much more about myself. So, guys, today we're doing a very interesting topic. We're basically gonna talk about how you can make your Flutter apps performant. Now, performance is often a major concern for developers as well as your clients and your users, because you you want to make sure that you ship out the ideal application that's responsive, that's not laggy, that's not even too bulky in size, so people can easily download it. So often we come across different performance issues, and we're going to be basically looking into those, which are the common performance issues that we face, and which are the common tips and techniques that we can leverage in order to make our Flutter apps performant. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'll basically be starting off with some of the background on Flutter, on performance in Flutter, so that you can see where basically we're starting off from, because inherently Flutter is by default, it's performant, okay? So if you just make a very basic application in Flutter, it's bound to be performant by default until and unless you've done some thing you shouldn't have been doing in the first place. So we'll be looking into how Flutter is by default performant and which of the main threads it uses, so that you can get some context into where this performance issues, where am all the performance issues coming from. Next, after getting some context into that, we'll be looking into top 5 tips that you can use for better rendering. This is for your Flutter, this is for your application's performance. Here we'll be looking into how you can control your app's lagginess, its slow performance, its responsiveness issues, and all of that stuff. And then lastly, we'll be looking into the top 3 techniques for app size reduction, which is a major concern. And this is something that especially I focus on a lot, because when we're talking about mobile applications, mobiles have a limited memory, okay? So you don't want to overwhelm your users by making your app too big that they can't use other apps, okay? So let's talk about the performance background, in which we'll be discussing 3 main threads that Flutter uses, which directly impacts the performance of a Flutter application. So the first thread is a UI thread. This is basically where you're building your widgets. Call it your build method, call it your main.dart. This is basically the thread that builds your widgets. Now, when I say build your widgets, I don't mean it displays it on the screen. By building widgets, I mean that the UI thread, it basically creates different objects of the widgets that you've been using, that you're using in your build methods. And it composes this widget tree, which it then passes on to your raster thread, which was previously known as the GPU thread. So the raster thread, or the GPU thread, that's responsible for displaying those widgets on the screen itself, all right? Now, when we're talking about the UI thread, it should be kept lightweight, it should be more breathable. You don't want to perform too much of the computation intensive tasks, because the purpose of UI thread is to just build widgets. That's it, okay? Nothing else. So keep it breathable, all right? The raster thread, on the other hand, You can control this directly, but you can see it in the performance overlay, which you can see right over here. This upper section displays the raster thread or the GPU thread, and the bottom section here represents the UI thread. So if you see these spikes in your raster thread, although you can't optimize it directly, but it'll give you it'll give you an intuition that you've done something wrong in your UI thread. So you need to be looking into your build methods. Have you built any widget incorrectly? Is there a poor state management somewhere in your build methods? Yada yada. We'll be looking into that in the next section of this topic. Okay. Now, and the third thread is the IO thread. It's basically used for expensive tasks such as async tasks or database requests, all of that stuff. So IO thread, as you all know, it's kept completely separate so that the UI thread can perform its task independently of the IO thread, so that it gives the users a sense of task parallelism, if you get what I mean, so that the UI is loaded, and while the IO thread is fetching your data from the internet or something like that, your UI is loaded and displayed on the screen, so that your app looks smooth to the user, and it doesn't give the impression that everything's happening in a linear order. Okay, now I know this was a bit of theory, and we developers, once we start doing development, we don't really care about theory, but performance is something that a little bit of context is necessary, not too much, but at least a little bit, so that you can diagnose your problems later on when you're trying to, test them for performance issues. So the next topic is render better, faster, stronger. Here we'll be discussing the top 5 tips and techniques that you can leverage in order to make your Flutter app more performant. Before I get into this, I would like to give this disclaimer that I know after this talk, you'll probably get really excited and you'll immediately head over to your previous applications and you'll try to optimize them as best as you can because, hey, you learned something new and you want to try it out and you want to see if it improved your performance, right? Please don't do that, okay? I mean, by all means, do all the experimentation that you want to do. But the important thing to understand is that you don't always have to do your optimizations for making your applications performant until and unless you've actually tested out your application and you've encountered various issues. Whether there's an issue in, let's say, an animation that's making your app really slow, or it's really laggy, or it's just not responsive. You keep clicking that button, but you're stuck. The screen seems frozen, okay? Until and unless you've tested out the application for performance-related issues, and you've come across some issues that you feel needs to be fixed, then head over to the specific section and do the necessary optimizations. Otherwise, don't do it. It might even make your app less performant because, like I said, Flutter apps are by default performant, okay? So the first technique is that don't overuse special effects. Now, when I'm talking about special effects, I'm talking about shadows, opacity, clip-in, all of that stuff. Now, by all means, if you have just one button on the screen that has a nice shadow, it has a nice opacity to it, by all means, do that. But let's say if you have a screen that has a list of different list tiles, let's say, and each of the items have their own opacity, they have their own shadows, and you're just using a lot of special effects. While that may look really pretty to you, it's actually really bad for your Flutter application. It's really bad for the application's performance. Now, why is that? Because these special effects, they're expensive. How are they expensive? Because when you're utilizing them, they allocate an off-screen buffer. It works similar to the way that when you're using a temporary variable to hold a temporary value for later use, that's exactly what's happening here. That extra bit of shadow that you're trying to add, it really triggers an allocation of an off-screen buffer. So now imagine an off-screen buffer for each of the items in your list. your app is done for and you're done for. It'll take a longer time to be built, and it'll impact your performance, and it'll make your app janky. Now, when I say jank, it's an official terminology which refers to the spikes that we saw here earlier. These spikes that you see, the really longer spikes, the ones that cover this full height, or just longer than the normal pattern that's being followed. It's called a jank. What the jank is, it reflects to a lag, meaning that while your widget was building, it's either skipped a couple of frames or it took a longer time to build. Now, the ideal rendering time is 60 FPS. So when you're trying to add in a lot of special effects, it might take longer time to build. So you might, Flutter might skip some frames in order to render this as a whole. So your app might look like it's frozen or it's working in a, I don't know, a really bad way, right? So instead of overusing these special effects, what you can do is that if you're using a lot of shadows, maybe try and explore different plugins that play with shadows relatively efficiently. If you're trying to use opacity, which we mostly do either in images, in animations, in containers, because we want to give it a nice blurry-ish look. If you want to do that, there are different techniques you can experiment with. If you're trying to give a faded look to an image, there is this widget called Fade an Image. You can try wrap your image into that instead of a normal image, and then play with the opacity parameters. If you're trying to create an animation that's a fading transition, there's a widget called Fade Transition for that, so you can look into that. And if you're just working with a normal container that has a nice opacity look to it, you can maybe experiment with the background and the foreground decoration properties, because that gives kind of like a layered approach, right? So again, just these are three of the techniques that you can work with. See what works best for you, and yeah. And of course, most of the times, we tend to use clipping widget. That's when we want to give a custom rounded look to a normal container or something like that. So surprisingly, clipping is also an expensive operation because it implicitly allocates an off-screen buffer, right? So instead of doing that, you could use the border radius property, in which you can specify that I want the radius over here, over here, over here, but not over here. Okay, so you can do all of that stuff. Next is refactoring widgets. Now, this is one of the most important techniques that really boost your application's performance. Now, as a starter in Flutter, what we tend to do is that, let's say we're creating different widgets in a column. What many people tend to do is that they're like, okay, separately creating each widget inside my column, that'll make my code look really lengthy and ugly. So what I'll do is that I'll create a separate method, and I will generate these list of different widgets in my method, and I'll call this method inside the children of my column. Now, this is really bad practice. You shouldn't do this because creating widgets, especially in methods, it wastes your CPU cycles. Because let's say you've created them in a method. Okay, now it's a stateful widget. If you've called set state anywhere in your screen, then you're done for, because that method, it'll lose all its history. It'll re-render each and everything in a linear fashion. Okay, that's a horrible way to do that. Instead, what you can do is that you can refactor your widgets. Now, what I mean by refactoring is that if you have a very complex widget, you can extract it out in a different file inside a different class. If it's a stateless widget, give it a stateless class. If it's a stateful widget, give it a stateful class. What this really helps you out with is that it really makes your code maintenance easy. It makes your code reusable, so that when you're later on working on a different project and you're like, okay, I want to create this widget again, you can directly navigate to this specific widgets file and you copy paste, and that's it. Okay, so it's reusable, it's ease of maintenance, it provides better state management, and we'll look into more And we'll look into this more deeply in the later sections. Okay, so basically, what when we're talking about state management, as a beginner, we tend to start off with set state because that's the simplest method of state management, right? Um, but when we're using set state, it needs to be localized so that when it changes the data that needs to be changed, okay, it doesn't rebuild the ancestors from all over again from the scratch. Okay, it just rebuilds that specific widget and its descendants. Okay, that's the ideal approach. When you refactor widgets, this becomes really easy. The state management becomes really easy because you know where you have to manage your state and how. So it's pretty easy to even localize your set state to the descendant level so that it prevents all of the ancestor widgets from rebuilding from scratch. Okay, so it really helps ensure that only the relevant widget tree or subtree is rebuilt. Okay, now the third thing is use constant widgets. Okay, if you already started with Flutter development, you must have already encountered this const keyword. We mostly use this in paddings, right? I personally use constant in paddings in text widgets. In specifically the text styles, I have a completely separate file for constants where I'm managing all that because I don't want the application to rebuild and recreate that style because it's just not necessary. It's just styling, right? So I use it there, and I use it in dimensions where I'm setting the height and the width. So like if you're doing your responsiveness coding, you want the application and the widgets to scale according to the dimensions of the physical device. You often tend to use media query. So what I do is that when I'm using that for specifying the dimensions of some widget, I use constant for a media query so that it just it gets initialized at compile time, and even if there are any changes encountered later on in any part of the widget tree, those constant widgets are not rebuilt because they're initialized at compile time. They won't be initialized again. So they're basically inherently, what they do is that they cache a widget and then reuse it later on when all of the other widgets are rebuilding. Okay, now let's look into an example for this. Here you can see, like just focus on the GIF on the right side, okay? The upper section, it denotes the raster thread or the GPU thread, and the bottom section, it denotes the UI thread. Now, as you can see, when it's 0, it started off with a lot of janks, okay? A lot of spikes. And you can see that as I keep hitting that plus button, it keeps showing spikes on and on and on and on and on, right? This is really bad practice because it indicates that, okay, something's going wrong. Now, remember initially I said that you can't access the GPU thread directly? Well, looking at the spikes in this GPU thread, we can see that there is an expensive widget that's being rebuilt over and over and over. Now, if you look at the screen, what expensive widget could we have? The 2 text widgets or the button widget? These are the simplest of the widgets that can be considered expensive, right? But what we do have is the background image. We're fetching this from the internet. And if we're simply just updating this number text, we don't want our background image to be rebuilt again and again and again. It's senseless, right? So what can we do over here is that we will be using const. Now, before I tell you how we can use const over here, let me just walk you through the code. This is the normal code that you will see when you create a default Flutter application, the default code that Flutter generates for you, except that I have wrapped my 2 text widgets inside the column of the 2 text widgets inside a stack so that I can show the background image at the bottom, right? So here you can see this is my stack where the first widget is the background widget. And in the background widget, this is a refactored widget, okay? The refactoring thing that I was just talking about. This is a refactored widget. And over here, you can see that I'm simply returning an image.network widget, meaning that I'm fetching some image from the network, from the internet, right? So that's all that I'm doing. Okay. And also, when I ran this code, I noticed that every time I press the plus button, this building homepage and building background widget, it appeared twice. Okay. So meaning that we just want this to be printed just once, right? But this was being printed over and over and over, implying that the background widget is being built over and over and over. Now, although we can use const widgets for padding, dimensions, text, textiles, anything, we can also use const for our own custom widgets. And it's pretty easy to do that. What you need to do is that you head over to your widget that you want to make it to const. You add in a const constructor like this, and then you just add the const keyword where you're consuming this widget. That's it. It's a two-step process. And if you see, if you look at this GIF on the right, you can see that while it does begin with the spikes initially, this app is much smoother, and no matter how many times I press the plus button, it doesn't encounter more janks. It doesn't encounter more spikes. So that's nice. We figured out that the background widget was the problem and we fixed it. And now notice these two spikes appearing in the UI thread. That's because of the text widget and the text style that we're using. We're using some kind of heavy styling, okay? In order to prevent this, you can store all of your text styles in a separate file by the name of constants, and you can make those text styles const variables, okay? And then you can later on use them where you're using them for styling, where you're referencing them for styling, okay? So with that technique, we will overcome these minor spikes in the UI thread as well. Okay, now the fourth tip is something that works like a charm, okay? So what lazy loading lists and grids mean is that lazy loading itself means to only render views or to only render widgets when they are scrolled into focus. What this means is that if you have, let's say, you want to display a list of 100 items, okay? But obviously your screen has a limited dimensions, so you can only show, let's say, 10 of the items at a time. If you use list view.builder, which is the lazy loading approach, what this will do is that it'll first it'll first build and render the first 10 widgets on the screen. Then as you start scrolling it slightly, as you can see in this GIF, it'll start rendering those other widgets as well. So what this does is that this way, your CPU and your GPU cycles, they're saved massively, okay? In contrast to if you just go ahead and use the normal list view, and in that you just pass in all of your children to be rendered, then what it will do is that it will render them together, like at the same time. And that will make your app really janky because you don't want that. You only want to show a person something when he's trying to see something, right? So this is one thing. So whenever you're working with grid views or list views, try using list view builder or grid view.builder when you're working with large items. If you're only working with a fixed number of items, let's say 3 to 5, then the normal list view or the normal grid view or a list view.count, the normal list view and the grid view.count should suffice, okay? Another technique that really comes in handy with lists is pagination. For those of you who don't know what pagination is a technique that fetches a limited set of data from the internet. And when you perform some action, let's say you press on the next button, then it fetches more data from the internet, okay? So it fetches in pages. So a good example of this is that when you're using Google, it showing page 1 of 50, right? So that's pagination. It's showing, let's say, top 10 results on page 1. Then when you head on over to page 2, it is showing the next 10 results, and so on and so forth. When we're talking about mobile applications, Um, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of these perform pagination in a sense when you're using their news feeds. When you're scrolling, and you're scrolling for a while now, and then you eventually hit this show more button, and when you click on that, it appends next data. It fetches the next part of the data and appends it to the previous list of items that you were looking at. So this is really handy. It really saves a lot of network requests. So most of the databases like Firebase, they have certain quotas, daily quotas or something like that. So you don't want to overuse your resources, right? You want to you want to show your users stuff when he wants to see. Okay, so like for instance, you're working on this chat module in an application, okay? And this chat module is a group chat module. So, it's a group, people are messaging all the time. Consider your family's group in WhatsApp, okay? Uncles and aunties are always bombarding messages that you don't even care about, right? So what you could do is that use listview.builder so that it's rendering only the relevant widgets that are into focus at that particular time. And try incorporating pagination into that. What that will do is that while everyone is bombarding all of those messages, until and unless your scroller or your cursor reaches a particular height, or in other words, you scroll into focus, all of that extra data will not be fetched from the network, okay? So your app will be smooth, and your app will be smooth. You won't have any performance issues, and so that's a really good thing that you should definitely try out, pagination, okay? And the next thing is, last but not the least, it is a use set state with caution. Like I said, beginners tend to use set state everywhere because it's easy to use, and it's really easy and simple approach for state management for beginners, right? But while this may get your work done, you need to understand that your set state should be used in its appropriate place. Okay, you don't want to use it too high up in your ancestor widgets. You just want to localize it to the relevant widget so that that widget itself and its descendants are rebuilt whenever the data changes, right? So now, why do you need to do that? Let's look into the life cycle for a bit so that you get a clearer idea of how set state actually works, right? So a typical life cycle of a widget looks like this. Like, first of all, the constructor is called. After constructor, the init state method is called. So if you're performing any tasks in init state, that's called, all right? Then by default, the widget is dirty itself, okay? The state is dirty. What being dirty means is that the build method should be triggered, the build method should be run. Okay, so by default, it's dirty because we want to invoke our build method. The build method has all of your widgets nicely placed. And then after the after the build method is done executing, the state is changed to clean, okay? Now, at this point, if you use your set state, let's say at a really high position in your ancestor widget, right? The use of set state will mark the state flag dirty, which means it will invoke your build method to be run from the scratch, okay? Now, if you've used a poor state management practices, if let's say you're just using set state and very high up in the widget tree where you didn't even have to use, you had to localize it, then it will rebuild your entire screen from top to bottom, which is a really bad approach. This is very similar to, let's say you've created this wonderful pizza, and the only mistake you did was that you added some pineapple topping to it. Now, when you presented this pizza to your family members go like, are you bonkers? Who eats pineapple on pizza? We want chicken or we want pepperoni. So the ideal situation is that you just want to pick off those pineapples and you want to replace them with chicken or pepperoni, right? That's what you should do. But what Flutter does is like, no, I'm going to throw away this pizza and I'm going to create this entire pizza from scratch, okay? So you don't want to do that. You just want to replace the topping. So when you just want to replace a topping, meaning you just want to replace some of the attributes or some of the widgets in your widget tree, you want to update them, you have to use some effective state management techniques. Now, people have been talking about provider, block, Redux, and all of that complicated stuff. But if you're just a beginner, you can just experiment with notifiers. Notifiers are of two types primarily, the value notifier and the change notifier. The value notifier works with just one specific data type, one specific value, a single value, whereas a change notifier, it works with different values, more complicated objects if you're working with that, and all of that stuff, right? Now, the interesting thing is that notifiers are by default provided by Flutter itself. So you don't have to include any third-party dependency or a plugin on all of that stuff. It's just plug in and use it. Okay, it's by default provided by Flutter. Now, let's look into an example for value notifiers and how it can help us with our performance. So here is an application that you can see. I have replaced my two text widgets with a simple container that takes in a color. So what's basically happening is that when I press that floating action button at the bottom right corner, whenever I push it, the color of my central widget, it is updated. Now this color, it's completely random. As you can see in the code, I'm using a random object to just generate it on the go. But what you can see is that it started off with really high spikes. See, it just look at the spikes, look at the janks that the UI thread and the GPU thread are showing. And then if you even notice closely, the more I press that button, the more laggy the app becomes, the more it just feels like it's frozen, especially when I over here now you'll see when the color becomes yellow, it becomes stuck. See over here. So we don't want that. This is so awful. Now let's look into the code what we're doing. We have a color object and we have a change color method, which is calling set state and updating the current color with the random color on the go, right? Then we have this container. The container is utilizing this current color. And once we're pressing this floating action button, it invokes the change color method, and it just computes this color on the fly, on the go, and it's really laggy. Also, you can see the frame rendering took 60 FPS, meaning it's utilizing the full FPS available. That is not good because, as you can see, our app is really laggy. Now let's take out set state and replace that with value notifier. Now, there are like 4 steps to implementing this, and it's really easy to do that. So what you need to do is, first of all, change your color variable from type color to type value notifier of type color, okay? So this is your color notifier over here. We've initialized it with the gray color like we did over here, okay? This is the equivalent of using a value notifier. Then inside your change color method, remove the set state, this set state where we were setting our current color. Remove this thing and instead just write color notifier.value equals to the same code as before, the random color, okay? Finally, in your dispose method, you need to ensure that you dispose of your notifier. If you don't, it'll keep accumulating memory that's no longer used. And this will result in memory leaks and size issues later in your app. So you want to be careful that you always dispose of your notifiers or listeners or controllers that you're using in your app, okay? So after doing that, the final thing is that replace your container with a value, wrap your container, this color container, inside a value listenable builder. And in its value listenable attribute, you want to pass color notifiers. So like, what should it listen to? It should listen to the color notifier itself, okay? And then we have this container itself in the builder. So what builder does is it passes the value that we can later on use in the widget that builder is invoking to be rendered. And that's it. That's all you need to do. And as you can see, this app is so much faster, so much smoother, and it doesn't even have that many janks. It gets normalized. And also, the frame rendering time is 49.6 FPS, which is pretty good. I mean, considering what we had earlier, which was 60 FPS. All right. Okay, so that was all about the rendering tips and techniques. Now we'll look into when your application is really bulky in size, how can you reduce your application size? Okay, so first of all, you need to remove all unused resources. What this includes is that any files that you've created that you're no longer using, any assets that you've added to your project but you're not even using them, even any unused imports. Let's say in any file you have an import that you previously used but then later on you're not using it, you need to remove all those unused imports, because these really accumulate resources and libraries, and they really add up to your application size. So you want to make sure that you remove all unused resources. And also, you need to ensure that you've taken care of all potential memory leaks, which I said earlier you can do by disposing of your listeners, controllers, notifiers, all of these stuff in your dispose method, so that when that particular screen is disposed, it's no longer there in your application. All of the resources are disposed right away. Okay, not included in the junk memory of your application. Okay. Next, you need to minify and minimize your assets. So you want to ensure that any assets that you're using, they are of minimal size. So it's better to compress all your PNG, JPG, or any other files that you're using. Mostly, if you don't have to use specifically a PNG file, an alternative is use a JPEG or a JPG, because that's the compressed version and it's really minimalistic in size. Okay. For any custom icons that you're using, use the SVG format. And if you're using images that are really contributing to the size of your application, then you can maybe look into an experiment with the Cache Network Image plugin. What this does is that it fetches these what you can do is that you can store these images, or you can store these assets on a third-party location, let's say Firebase storage. So what it'll do is, like, the first time this app is downloaded and the user uses it for the very first time, it'll fetch these assets from the internet, from the third-party location where it's stored. And using this cache network image, it'll inherently cache it. So when the user uses the app the second time, the third time, and so on and so forth, it's not fetching it from the internet again and again. It's cached, and cache is much better to what you have actually in store. Okay, so like cache is more lightweight than the actual assets themselves. So look into it. If you're using a lot of images that you've stored into your project, try maybe experimenting with the cache network image, so that it eases some load over there. And then, of course, support a limited number of screen densities. Now, of course, you want to make your app responsive to each of the dimensions, each of the device's dimensions. So you want to ensure that the widgets are built accordingly. So for that, you don't have to use a lot of different assets for like 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, up to 10x. Just use a limited number of screen densities, okay? And you will be good to go, because even in native Android, we have, it supports up to like 5 screen densities. So yeah, just play with the limited number of screen densities, so it doesn't add up to the resources or the assets in your application, right? Lastly, you can use obfuscation. What obfuscation is that it's a process of hiding or maybe shortening up of methods, variables, and basically the entire code itself. And the reason this is done is to primarily make reverse engineering difficult, so that nobody can crack your application and find out the potential vulnerabilities. But doing so, the added benefit is that it greatly reduces your application size, okay? I have personally experimented with this, and I can say that it really reduces your app size. Why is that? Because as you can see in this example over here, we have this method called calculate payroll. It's a big name, right? It's a big string. It has only replaced this with a, and then we have this specialist employee group. This is also represented. This is also replaced with different symbols. So what this does is basically that when you're trying to obfuscate, it generates this symbol map, so it knows which string is replaced by what shorter string. So it generates a symbol map that you can keep in your local system, and you can use it when you're trying to decompile the application yourself. Okay, you can definitely try it out. You can definitely experiment with it, but just a heads up, it has one disadvantage, which is that since it does all these shortening and all of this stuff, some of the functions or some of the variables, they become unusable because the compiler or the engine, it can't find that particular method. So let's say we have this method calculate payroll, but it was replaced with these shorter symbols. So this usually happens in Firebase and other custom methods that you've made. Now I don't know about Flutter, but in Android, what we had was there was this thing called ProGuard, where we would define rules that you can exclude this from being obfuscated. Okay, so so far I haven't come across a similar thing in Flutter, where it allows you to write your own custom rules for obfuscation. But this is an issue that people often face. So if you want to experiment with it, be my guest. Feel free to do so. But do keep in mind that you might run into this issue. So, yeah. And that's about it. Now we'll be heading on to our favorite Flutter quiz that you can attempt. So obviously, before we head into that, this is my contact. If you have absolutely any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on my email address, which is sakina@reactree.com. And of course, in this, the purpose of this talk was to equip you guys with the necessary context of why or what reasons contribute to performance issues in your application, right? If you're more interested to know about the tools that you can use and how to basically use those tools to understand and to basically check your application's performance, let us know in the comments, and maybe later we'll design something to combat that. Okay, so yeah, over to you, Walid.
Thank you so much, Sakina. That was, that was one great presentation, and I hope that this is the things that you've discussed. They are pretty much, some really cool tips and tricks for people who are, new into this. So the best part of your presentation was that when a person presses a button, so I have to throw the whole pizza into the dustbin, and I have to rebuild a new one. So that's the most important part. So I should not be needing to throw the whole pizza in the dustbin. I should be
Exactly.
able to. So that is good. So guys, now I'll share the link. Yeah, I have seen the comments, तो मैं जो है वो link comments में share कर दूंगा. Let me just share it on the screen as well. So guys, it's 9:19 and I'm sharing it. So you guys have 15 minutes now. Just let me paste it in the comments as well. Precisely after 20 minutes, after 15 minutes, like it's 20, so 20, 30, 35. At 35, we'll stop taking responses for the quiz. And best of luck. And let's hope that people participate. So Sakina, thank you so much. If you want to say anything, this is the time right now. So then we just get out of this, and then this show will automatically end in 15 minutes.
All I have to say is that best of luck. And if you guys need to, I was just reading the comments, and some of you guys had an issue that the code was not visible. I'm really sorry about that. But if you want to learn more about it, just ping me on LinkedIn, and I'll send you a link of this, or maybe I'll send the link to Walid and he can share it on Facebook so that you guys can view the code yourself. Okay,
Best, best. Thank you so much, Sakina.
you're welcome.